At 71, Opal Quigley believed that 40 years of feeding a family earned you a chair at its table. She would learn otherwise before the cake was cut. It happened at the Elks Lodge on Santa Fe Avenue in Salina, Kansas, on a cold Tuesday in October. It was her retirement supper. 40 years on the co-op scale, and half the town had turned out to say kind words over ham and scalloped potatoes. Her son Brett stood up to give the toast. He was a developer now, with a good watch and a better smile. He thanked her for her service and called her a pillar of the community. And then, while the room was still warm with applause, he slid a folded envelope across the cake plate and asked her very gently to sign it. It was not a thank you card. It was a notice to vacate. By the time the sun set on that rusted tower at the dead end of North Ohio Street, the daughter they called a burden would own the one thing her son was about to lose everything for, and she would buy it for $4. But that was still weeks away. On the night of the supper, Opal knew none of it. She only knew the paper in her hand weighed more than paper should. What Brett did not know, what none of them in that warm room knew, was that the old man the town had buried as a failure had left his daughter the one fortune in Saline County a bank could never seize. It was not locked in any vault. It was written on a wall, in numbers that one living person could still read. Her father had told her once that the heaviest bin is the empty one. She had been 9 years old, sweeping chaff off the catwalk. It would take her another 62 years to understand he had meant it as a map. The toast had begun kindly enough an hour before. Brett had a way of making hard things sound like good sense. He stood with his coffee cup raised and told the room how difficult it was to watch a parent grow older, how a person could love his mother dearly and still see, clear-eyed, when the time had come to get her set up somewhere safe. Mom has given this town 40 years, he said. She should not have to spend her last good ones worrying about a furnace and a mortgage and stairs she can barely climb. The room murmured. Wasn't that thoughtful? Wasn't Brett a good son to think of it? Opal sat with her hands folded in her lap, in the green dress she had pressed that morning over the ironing board. In her apron pocket, she could feel the brass test weight, the 1-ounce poise her father had carried for 30 years before her. Cold, smooth, certain against her hip. She had brought it out of habit. 40 years of habit does not stop on a Tuesday. So the family found her a place, Brett went on, real nice. Meals included, nurse on the floor, and the house, well, he smiled down at the cake. It's just dead money sitting there. Family money. Better to free it up now than lose every dime of it later to some nursing home, am I right? Then he slid the envelope across the plate. His sister Marlene had her phone up, recording, the little red light steady as a wedding. She was smiling the way people smile at a surprise party, and half the room thought that was exactly what they were watching, some kind of generous send-off. The other half had gone very quiet. "Go on, Mom," Brett said. "Open it." Opal opened it. She read it the way she read everything, slowly, top line to bottom, her lips moving over the words. 30 days to vacate. The house on Highland Avenue, the one she had kept for 31 years, already sold to a holding company she had never heard of. And on the second page, in blue ink, her own son's signature. She set the paper on the tablecloth and smoothed it flat with the side of her hand. "You sold my house," she said. Not loud. Opal was never loud. "I freed up an asset," Brett said. "There's a difference, Mom." Someone near the coffee urn laughed, certain it was a joke. Marlene's phone swung toward the laugh and back. "You could say thank you," Marlene said from behind the screen. "Most people don't get a send-off like this, Mother." Opal counted something on her fingers under the table, quietly, the way she always had. Then she folded the notice along its crease, once, and slid it into her apron pocket beside the brass weight. She did not cry. She did not argue. She thanked the room for the supper because the casseroles had been kind even if the toast had not, and she walked out to her truck under a sky already gone dark. Here is the part the lodge could not see. Brett was not a cruel man so much as a cornered one, and cornered men sign papers they cannot take back. His company had 200 storage units going up north of town, a development called Prairie Crossing. built on a loan with a balloon payment due in 90 days, the kind of payment that does not bend. To make it, he needed land, cheap land with a rail spur, and the last parcel like that in Salina sat at the dead end of North Ohio Street, where his grandfather's grain elevator had stood rusting for 50 years. He needed his mother moved and the old dead money freed before the bank did to him precisely what it had once done to Hollis Quigley. He told himself he was saving her. He was running, and he had decided she was strong enough to carry the weight of his running. He was right about the strong part. He had no idea how right. To understand why a notice to vacate did not break Opal Quigley, you have to know what she had done for a living and what the town had decided that was worth. For 40 years, she had been the weighmaster at the Salina Farmers Co-op, down past the Union Pacific Spur. When a truck rolled onto the platform scale loaded with wheat or milo or yellow corn, it was Opal who read the weight. Opal who pulled a sample and graded it by hand. She bit the kernels between her teeth to judge the moisture. She smelled the load for rot and smut. She caught short loads and wet loads, and once, famously, a man who had soaked his grain to make it weigh heavier, and she sent him home without $1. The farmers respected her. The young hands at the elevator called her the scale lady. Just leave it with the scale lady. She only reads numbers. A kid in a ball cap had told a trucker once, right in front of her, as if reading numbers were the easy part. It was not the easy part. Her father had taught her that. Hollis Quigley had run his own elevator on Ohio Street back before the drought years, the tall concrete tower the town now called the Ghost on Ohio. He taught his daughter to grade grain with her hands and her nose when she was barely tall enough to see over the hopper. And he taught her something else, something he gave to no one else alive. He kept his tallies in a private cipher, a code of his own making, numbers that looked like bushel weights and were not, so that no buyer and no banker could ever skim a load behind his back. A man can steal what he can read, he told her. Keep the real books in your head and keep your head out of his reach. Then the bank came, the way the bank always came in those years, and they took the elevator and the scales and the house, and Hollis died not long after owing more than he left. The town did its arithmetic and decided he had been a failure. And his daughter, the only person who had ever read his real books, wore that verdict like a coat for 50 years. She never once defended him out loud. She simply went and weighed the town's grain, honestly, every day, for 4 decades, as if accuracy itself were a way of saying her father had not been a thief. The week before the supper, the co-op had finally closed the old scale house for good, and Opal had spent 3 days cleaning it out. The new manager was a young woman named Tamsin Okafor, sharp and kind, who had reopened the little building only to take inventory. Opal handed over the keys, wiped down the counter one last time, and carried home nothing but her coffee mug and the brass poise in her pocket. She had thought that was the hard goodbye. She had been wrong about that, too. 30 days. That was what the notice gave her. She did not use all 30. There is a particular arithmetic to being told you are a burden by the people you spent your life carrying. And Opal did the sum quickly and decided not to make anyone wait on her account. She packed the house on Highland Avenue into 11 boxes and a cedar chest. Brett sent a man with a trailer. Marlene sent a text. Neither of them came to the door. For 2 nights, she stayed at the Ridgeview Motel on the edge of town, $62 a night, watching the number in her checkbook get smaller. On the 3rd morning, she sat in the truck in the motel lot with her coffee and read the county legal notices in the back of the Salina Journal, the way she read everything, top to bottom. And there, between a delinquent water bill and a sheriff's auction, she found it. Tax sale, Saline County. 1 parcel, North Ohio Street. The old Quigley elevator, 90 feet of concrete and tin, 9 bins, a boot pit, a catwalk, seized for back taxes and unsold for 50 years. Minimum bid, the unpaid balance the county had long since written off, $4. Her father's name in the newspaper, with a price on it. She drove down to the county building on a Wednesday morning. The auction was held in a side room with folding chairs and bad fluorescent light, run by a clerk named Pruitt who read the parcels off in a bored voice. When he got to the elevator, he did not even look up. Nobody wanted 90 feet of rusting tower at the dead end of a street that led nowhere. There were no other bidders. There had not been a bidder on that parcel in 50 years. Going once, Pruitt said. Anybody. $4. Opal raised her hand. She counted the money out of her wallet on the clerk's counter, 3 ones and 4 quarters, and signed the deed in the same slow hand she signed everything. Opal Quigley. Pruitt stamped it without ceremony and slid her a receipt. And just like that, the daughter the town had pitied for 50 years owned the very thing it had pitied her father for losing. She drove out North Ohio Street alone, past the Union Pacific Spur and the Co-op feedlot, to the dead end where the ghost on Ohio stood against a flat gray sky. Up close, it was bigger than memory. Rust ran down the tin in long brown streaks, as if the tower had been weeping for half a century. The windows of the office shack were gone. Pigeons turned in the head house 90 feet up. She walked the base slowly, one hand trailing the cold concrete, and stopped where the afternoon light cut across the north wall. Under 50 years of rust and peeling paint, she could just make out the old letters her father had brushed on by hand, Q-U-I-G. And then, where the rest should have read Quigley and Sons, the way every elevator in Kansas did, the paint said something else, Quigley and Daw. The rest had flaked away to nothing. She stood looking at that a long time. Then she walked the row of bins, 9 of them, and tried each hatch. 8 opened with a groan of old steel. The 9th, bin 9, did not. Someone had welded it shut, a thick gray bead of solder run all the way around the seam, the only sealed bin of the 9, and no one left in town remembered why. She put her palm flat against the cold steel of it and felt nothing but cold. "All right," she said quietly, to her father, to the tower, to no one at all. "All right, let's see what you left me." She slept that night at the Ridgeview Motel with the tax deed folded on the nightstand, under the lamp, where she could see it if she woke. And she did wake, twice. And both times the paper was still lying there. And both times she read it through, top line to bottom, to be sure the county had not changed its mind in the dark. Opal Quigley, her own name on her father's tower. The third time she gave up on sleep altogether. She made the thin coffee in the little machine bolted to the wall and stood at the window while the lot went from black to gray. And a little after 6, she drove back out North Ohio Street, because a woman who owns a thing ought to be standing inside it when the sun comes up on it. She was not the only soul in Salina who read the legal notices in the back of the journal. A little before 8, a dusty hatchback came down the gravel off the spur road and rolled to a stop beside her truck, and Tamsin Okafor climbed out with a cardboard box hugged against her hip. She was bundled in a canvas coat too big for her breath showing white in the cold, and she stood a moment looking up the 90 feet of streaked tin the way everyone looked at it the first time, as if it might lean down over her and say something. "They told me at the co-op you'd lost your mind," Tamsin said, "buying this." "I expect they did," Opal said. "I told them you were the only one in this town who hadn't." Tamsin shifted the box against her hip. "Can I set this down somewhere out of the wind?" They went into the old office shack at the base of the tower, where the windows were gone and the floor was an inch deep in pigeon and chaff, and Tamsin set the box on the one surviving counter and pulled back the flaps. Inside were ledgers, a dozen of them, fat cloth-bound books gone gray with age. When I cleaned out the scale house, Tamsin said, there was a cabinet in the back, locked. My manager's key didn't fit it. None of the co-op keys fit it. I finally had a locksmith come out, and this is what was in there. 40 years of them. She lifted one out and turned it in her hands. I thought at first they were the official books. They're not. The official tickets are all on file downtown. Every load, every signature. These are something else. They're written in some kind of, I don't know what to call it, shorthand, a code. Nobody at the co-op can read a single line of it. The district manager wanted to throw the whole cabinet in the dumpster. She paused. I didn't let him. I figured if anybody alive knew what they were, it'd be the woman who'd had the only key. She held the book out across the counter. Opal took it and opened it, and the world went very quiet for her. It was her own hand. 40 years of her own careful figures. Column after column, in the cipher her father had taught her on the catwalk when she was 9 years old. Every working day of her life she had stood at the public scale and read the weight, honest and true, and written the official ticket. And then, at the end of the day, she had sat in the back of the scale house and kept a second book that no one ever asked to see. A private accounting in a code no living man could break, because Hollis had told her once that a number you cannot prove is a number a thief can change. It was how she had caught the man who soaked his grain. Her honest public scale had passed his load. Her secret book had not. Nobody had ever known the second book existed. Nobody had ever thought to wonder what the scale lady did after the trucks went home. Nobody else can read these, Tamsin said. It was not quite a question. Can you? Opal turned a page, then another. Her lips moved over the figures, the way they always had. Every line, she said. Tamsin looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in the young woman's face that was not pity, which was a thing Opal had not seen, aimed at herself in a very long while. It was closer to awe. Then they're yours, Tamsin said. They were always yours. She zipped her coat to the chin. I'm not here to save you, Miss Quigley. I don't think you need it. I just didn't want the only person who could read them to never know they'd survived. She left the box on the counter and drove back up the gravel, and Opal stood alone in the cold shack with 40 years of her own secret arithmetic stacked in front of her, and a thought arrived, quiet and certain as a weight settling on a scale. Her father had kept his real books in his head and in this code. The bank had taken everything a bank could read and carry off, the concrete and the scales and the house. But anything Hollis Quigley had truly meant to keep, he would not have put in a vault or a safe deposit box where any clerk could open it. He would have hidden it the way he hid everything that mattered. Here, in the one place the whole county had already agreed was worth nothing, written in the one language only his daughter could still read. The heaviest bin is the empty one, she said out loud to the empty room. She did not yet know what the words meant, but for the first time in 50 years, she let herself believe they meant something, and that her father had spoken them to her on purpose, 62 years ago, knowing she would need them long after he was gone. That was when she heard the second engine on the gravel. An old long bed truck, primer gray and patched with house paint, came nosing down to the dead end, and a man got out of it slow, the way very big and very old men get out of trucks, one boot down first, then a hand on the door, then the rest of him after. He was past 80 if he was a day, a barrel of a man gone soft at the middle, in a feed cap and a canvas coat, the twin of Tamsin's. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked up at the head house a long while before he looked at her. You're Hollis's girl, he said. You got the look of him around the eyes. I'm Opal, Earl Sopko. He put out a hand like a catcher's mitt and swallowed hers up gentle in it. I ran the leg in this house better than 30 years, back when she still turned, carried more wheat up that boot than the good Lord made rain. He nodded at the tower the way a man nods at an old horse he used to ride. Heard down at the Cozy Inn this morning that Hollis Quigley's daughter went and bought the Ghost on Ohio for $4 cash. I figured that for a lie and drove out to enjoy proving it. It's not a lie. No. Something moved in his big seamed face. No, I can see it ain't. He was quiet a moment, and then he told her a thing she had never heard in all her 71 years. Your daddy did me a kindness once and made me swear to keep it quiet while he drew breath. 1974. Bad year, that one. Dry as a bone. I had a little place out on the Niles Road, and the note came due, and I couldn't make it. Not the half of it. I went to the bank with my hat in my hands, ready to beg, and the fellow there looks at his book and looks at me funny and says, "Earl, there's nothing owing. Somebody'd already paid the whole of it." Cleared the slate. Earl's jaw worked. Took me 11 years to find out who. And when I finally cornered the man and asked him why in the world he'd pay a debt that wasn't his for a fellow who could never pay him back, you know what your father said to me? He said a full bin doesn't miss what it pours into an empty one. And then he made me promise not to breathe it to a living soul until he was in the ground. Earl looked at her, and his eyes were wet in the cold. "He's been gone a long time now, Opal. I reckon I'm free of that promise. And I reckon a man who got his whole life handed back to him owes that family a strong back whenever it comes calling. So whatever it is you've come out here to do, you are not going to do it by yourself. You hear me?" Opal had to look away for a moment, out past the rail spur, before she trusted her voice. Her own son had slid a paper across a cake to be rid of her, and here stood a stranger in a feed cap, weeping on the gravel over a kindness her father had done half a century ago, ready to give her his hands. She thought, not for the first time, that blood was a poor way to measure a family. "There's something in this tower," she said at last. "My father left it. I'd like to find it. Will you help me look?" "That's the only reason I climbed out of the truck," Earl said. He had a work light coiled in the bed, a yellow drop bulb on 50 feet of cord, and a little gas generator he set sputtering on the gravel by the door. Inside, the base of the elevator opened up into a cathedral of dead machinery. The drive belts, rotted to ribbons, the great iron leg climbing up into the dark toward the head house 90 feet overhead, the air thick and close with a smell Opal had carried in the back of her memory her whole life and had not truly breathed in 50 years. Old grain gone to powder, rust and damp concrete, and the ghosts of 10,000 harvests. "Boot pits down yonder," Earl said, and swung the light over a black square hole in the floor where a steel ladder dropped away below grade. "Watch the third rung." She was always soft. "You sure about this? It ain't exactly a parlor down there." "I have been climbing in and out of grain pits since before you ran that leg, Earl Sopko," Opal said, and put her foot on the first rung. "Hold the light steady and let an old woman work." She went down first. The boot pit was the bottom of everything, a cramped concrete room beneath the floor of the world, where the iron boot of the leg sat in its housing, the low, dark place all the grain in the tower had once fallen to before the buckets carried it up to the sky. It was bitter cold down there and damp, and the work light threw the shadows long and strange. Opal stood at the bottom of her father's elevator and turned herself around slowly, and she thought about something Earl had let drop up in the daylight, an offhand thing that Hollis used to climb down into the boot when there was no work that called a man down. A person does not sit alone in a freezing pit for the company of it. A person sits there because there is something in it worth the cold. She ran her hands along the boot housing, over the cold riveted steel, feeling for she did not know quite what, while Earl played the light slow over her shoulder. And on the back face of the housing, low, in a place where a body would have to kneel down in the muck to see it at all, her fingers found a seam that was not a rivet line. A square of steel set flush into the steel, painted over in the same dead gray as all the rest, so filthy and so flat that 100 inspectors could have run a hand across it and felt nothing but cold iron. A little tin door, welded at 3 corners, hung on a hinge at the 4th, and scratched into the paint of it, so faint she had to bring her face down close in the lamplight to read it. 2 letters in her father's careful hand. Not HQ, not Quigley and Sons, the way every other thing in that tower was marked. 2 different letters. OQ, her own initials, scratched into a tin, welded into a pit, sunk in the dark at the very bottom of a tower the whole town had written off, in a place where only a person who knew to look and knew how to read would ever find them. You have already guessed there is something inside that tin. You have not yet guessed what it is going to cost her to read it. Earl, she said without turning around, hand me down that pry bar. The little welds were only tacks, rust soft with 50 years of damp, and they cracked one at a time under the bar, sharp little reports in the close concrete dark. The door groaned back on its corroded hinge. Inside, wrapped in a square of oilcloth gone stiff as board, was a slim book. Opal worked it free and lifted it out with both hands, careful, the way you lift a thing newly born. Under the oilcloth was a chalk ledger, its pages soft with the damp of half a century but holding still, and down every page ran column after column of figures in her father's hand, each one headed and ruled like the plainest bushel weight record any elevator in Kansas ever kept. Any banker who pried it out of that pit would have glanced at it, seen the dull arithmetic of an ordinary failed elevator, and tossed it back in the muck. Opal knew better at a single glance. She had been reading the very same code upstairs in 40 years of her own books, not 1 hour before. These were not bushel weights. She did not yet know what they were, but she knew, kneeling there in the cold with her father's secret cupped in her two hands, that she was going to find out, and that there was not one other living person in all of Salina County who could have knelt where she was kneeling and understood the first thing about what she was looking at. "I'm going to need a table," she said quietly, "and a good lamp, and a few days where nobody bothers me." "You'll have all three," Earl said from the top of the ladder. She climbed up out of the boot pit with the ledger buttoned inside her coat, flat against her heart, and stepped back out into the hard, bright cold of the morning. The ghost on Ohio stood over her, 90 feet of rust and ruin and dead rail spur against a flat white sky, and for the first time in 50 years, it did not look to her like a thing the town had buried and forgotten. It looked like a thing that had been waiting for her. Earl carried a long folding table in from the bed of his truck on one shoulder, as if it weighed nothing at all, and stood it up in the old office shack where the morning came gray and clean off the smoky hill and through the empty window frames. Opal swept the worst of the chaff off the surviving counter and laid her work out the way Hollis had taught her to lay out a day, every tool in its place before the first figure was ever set down. The dozen cloth ledgers from Tamsin's box went on her left. The slim chalk ledger from the tin went on her right, still giving off the cold mineral smell of oilcloth in the pit. Between them, she unrolled a length of butcher paper Earl found behind the door for the working. And at the top of the table, where a person keeps the one tool she trusts above all the others, she set the brass poise from her apron pocket, a little 1-ounce calibration weight worn smooth as a river stone by 60 years of her father's thumb, and then by her own. "You want coffee in you before you start?" Earl asked. "I want quiet," she said, not unkindly. "Come back at noon and I'll tell you what I've found." He went. She sat down in the cold with her coat still buttoned to the chin, and she opened the chalk ledger to its first whole page, and she began to read. The book was laid out like the plainest thing in the world, a column for the date, a column for the bin, 1 through 9, in her father's blocky hand, and a column of weights, bushels and pounds, running down the page in the cipher, the same slant figures she had been setting down in her own books for 40 years. To any other eye on God's earth, it was the dull pulse of a working elevator, grain in and grain out, a number for every day the doors stood open. Opal read it the way other women read scripture, with her lips moving and her finger going down the line and her free hand counting the carries off against her thumb, and within the hour she had the shape of it. The cipher was her father's, and it was hers, and it gave up its plain meaning to her the way a lock gives to the one key in the world cut to fit it. And that was when the trouble started, because the numbers were wrong. She knew these bins. She had stood under them and climbed over them her whole girlhood. She knew which ones her father filled for shipping and which he kept for screenings, and which one, the 9th, The far one against the rail's spur had stood welded shut and dead since before she was tall enough to see over the scale rail, and the chalkbook did not agree with one single thing she knew. Bin 4, which she could have sworn on her mother's grave, had gone out full to the boards in the last good harvest before the end. The chalkbook gave almost nothing, a figure so small it would not have filled a coffee can. And bin 9, the dead one, the sealed one, the one that had never in her living memory held a kernel of anything at all. The chalkbook gave a weight so large she had to count the columns over twice on her fingers to be sure she was reading it true. The heaviest weight in the whole book belonged to the one bin she knew for a fact was empty. She closed the book on her thumb and sat a while with the cold coming up through the floorboards, and she thought, "There is a mistake here, and my father did not make mistakes in his figures, not one in his whole life, so the mistake must be in me." She decided to go and look with her own two eyes. The stairs up the head house were steel, riveted, ringing under her shoes, and they climbed in tight switchbacks up the inside of the tower, past the mouths of the bins, and Opal went up them slow and steady, one hand always on the cold rail, the way her father had taught her. "Never trust your feet on a grain stair," he used to say. "Trust your hand." Pigeons broke from the dark above her and clattered out through a broken pane into the white sky over North Ohio Street. 90 feet up, the catwalk ran out across the tops of the bins under the iron roof of the head house, a narrow steel walk with the round black throats of the bins opening on either side of it. And she went along it, lifting the inspection lids one at a time and looking down into the dark of each with Earl's work light. Bin 1, a cone of old wheat gone to dust and crust. Bin 4, scoured clean down to the steel, exactly as the chalkbook said and exactly as her own memory had not. So the book was right, and she was wrong, and that turned something over hard in her chest, because if she was wrong about bin 4, she might be wrong about a great many things she had carried as gospel for 50 years. She came to the 9th bin last. Its lid was not a lid at all, but a plate, welded down at every edge. The welds old and sure, a young man's welds, and she knew without being told whose hand had laid them. She knelt and put her palm flat on the cold steel of it and felt nothing. No chill spot of grain banked below, no gev, only the dead iron cold of a thing sealed and forgotten. And kneeling there, with the work light thrown sideways along the curve of the bin wall, she saw the paint. It was under the rust, under the flaking gray the bank's man had rolled over everything the year they took it. An older coat, a good cream color a sign painter would have charged a farmer extra for, and the letters of it stood up faint as a watermark when the light raked across them low. She had grown up under the sign out on the road that said, Quigley and Sons. She had worn that name like a stone in her shoe her whole life. The sons that were never born, the elevator that had passed to a town, and a tax roll instead of to her. But this was not that sign. This was older than that sign. This was the first one, the true one, laid down before the world ever got its hands on the place. And what it said in letters a foot tall, going around the curve of the 9th bin, where her father had sealed his secret, was Quigley and Daw, and then the rust took the rest of it. Quigley and daughters. She stayed on her knees a long time up there in the cold. She would not let herself finish the thought that was rising in her, because she had finished too many hopeful thoughts in her long life and watched every one of them come to nothing in her hands. And an old woman learns to ration her hope the way she rations everything else in a thin year. She went back down the 90 feet a good deal slower than she had come up. There was a car in the yard when she came out. A clean old sedan pulled in past her truck, and a woman was getting out of the passenger side with the help of a young man who had her by the elbow. She was older than Earl, older than anyone Opal had spoken to in years, small and straight as a fence post in a good wool coat, her face folded soft by all its decades, and her eyes gone nowhere at all. "You won't know me," the old woman said. "I'm Lucille Brandt. I farmed the Brandt quarter out on the Headville Road 51 years, until my knees told me no. Your father weighed my grain from the year I was widowed to the year he passed, and there's not a soul left in Salina but me who'd remember it." She steadied herself on the young man's arm. "This is my grandson. He drove me when he heard where it was I wanted to go. I read in the journal you'd bought the old elevator, and I have carried a thing in my Bible better than 40 years that I promised a good man I'd put in the hand of his girl, and not one day before. I expect I'm the last one breathing who recalls I promised it." From inside her coat, she drew a flat parcel of waxed paper, and from inside that, soft and browned along the folds, a single page. Opal knew it before it was all the way open. It was a leaf out of the chalk ledger, torn clean along the gutter with the binding thread still hanging in it. The page that was missing. She had felt the gap that very morning under her thumb, the place where a leaf had been lifted out, and had thought it lost to the damp or the mice half a century ago. "He gave it me the last winter he was well," Lucille said, while her grandson held her steady against the wind. "I'd brought in my fall wheat, and it was poor, the poorest I ever grew, and I knew to the penny what it was worth, because a widow learns her own arithmetic fast. And your father weighed it and graded it, and paid me near double what it could ever have brought to an honest scale. And when I stood at his window and told him he'd made an error, he leaned out at me and said, 'Lucille, a full bin does not miss what it pours into an empty one.' And then he folded this page small and pressed it into my hand and closed my fingers over it and said, 'You keep this for my Opal. You give it to her when she's ready and not before, and you never let on you've got it.' And I never did. I buried a husband, and I buried near everybody I started out with. And I kept this old man's page in my Bible the whole long while, because a promise is the one thing they cannot come and take off you in a hard year." Opal took the page in both hands. The grandson got his grandmother settled back into the warm car to wait, and Opal carried the page inside to the table and laid it in its place, and the book was whole again. And now she could read the whole shape of what her father had done, and it stopped her cold. The missing page was the first page, the one that set the terms for all the rest, and across the top of it, not in the cipher at all, but in his plain hand, for her eyes and no other on earth, her father had written a single line. It said, "For my daughter, who can read what they cannot weigh." Below it, the columns began, and Opal followed them down with her finger, and the thing she had half seen that morning stood all the way up now and would not be argued out of the room. Every bin she knew had run full. The book showed near empty. The one bin that had stood empty and sealed her whole life, the book showed heaviest of all. Her father, the most honest man ever to set a weight in Saline County, the man who had once caught a thief by nothing but the daylight between a public book and a private one, had filled a secret ledger with weights that were every last one of them false. You have probably already guessed why an honest man would keep a whole book of false weights. Opal had not, and neither yet have you. She sat with it as the short day went gray in the empty windows. Why would Hollis Quigley, who had taught her on this very ground that a number you cannot prove is a number a thief can change, set down a single figure that was not true? It was the one thing in all the world she would have sworn the man could not bring himself to do. She turned the poise over and over in her fingers while she thought. The small brass weight gone warm now from her hand, and she did not yet understand that she was rolling the answer between her own two fingers the whole time. Earl came back at noon, and she sent him for a lamp and a bulb and a can of fuel, and he came again at dusk and found her where he had left her, in her coat, in the cold, the butcher paper gone black with figures she had set down and crossed out and set down again. He did not say a word. He lit the lamp and stood it by her elbow and laid a wrapped sandwich beside it, and lowered himself onto an upturned crate by the door to keep her company in the way of old country people, which is to say, without speaking at all, and he stayed, he She worked the figures every way she knew. She read the false weights as true and got nonsense. She read them backward and got worse. She added the columns and halved them and laid them against her own 40 years of books, hunting the place where they might rhyme, and they would not rhyme. And somewhere near midnight she put her face down in her 2 cold hands, an old woman alone with her father's riddle, and she was nearer to setting it down for good than she would ever own to a living soul. And then her thumb, moving the way it had moved her whole life when her mind was working a thing, found the brass poise on the table and turned it over, and her eye fell on the flat of the underside, the face she had rubbed smooth across 60 years, and never one time read, because you do not read a weight, you trust it. But there were numbers stamped down into the brass. Every true calibration poise carries them, the certified figure of just how far the casting falls shy of a perfect ounce, the small, honest confession a weight makes of its own error, so a careful man can correct for it. Her father had been the most careful man she ever knew, and the offset stamped into that brass was not the number any factory in the world would have struck there. It was his number. He had filed the true mark away and cut his own into the metal, a figure that meant nothing to any scale on earth, and everything to the one book it was ever made to balance. Her hands were not quite steady when she took up the pencil. She read the offset off the bottom of the poise, the number her father had hidden in the plainest sight there is, in her own apron pocket, for 50 years, and she carried it down the columns of false weights, balancing each one against it the way you balance a load against a known weight on the beam, and the numbers fell into true. Bin by bin, line by line, the false weights came right, and they were not weights at all. They were a tally of another kind entirely, a reckoning her father had folded inside a reckoning, and every figure of it, every road and rail and dollar of it, ran downhill to the same place, the empty bin, the sealed one, the ninth. The heaviest bin is the empty one. He had said it to her on the catwalk when she was 9 years old, with the wind coming off the prairie and her hand small in his. He had said it knowing she would not understand it for 60 years, and that on the night she finally did, she would be the only living soul who could. Opal Quigley set down the pencil. She looked up the dark throat of the tower toward the 9th bin, 90 feet over her head. The bin her father had welded shut with his own hands and marked with his first and truest name for the place, the name going around the curve of it under 50 years of rust. And for the first time in longer than she could say, she let the hopeful thought come all the way up, and she did not ration it. "You provided for me the whole time," she said, low and exact, to the lamp and the cold and the old man gone gray-faced and dozing by the door. "You provided for me the whole time, and you knew not one of them would ever lay a hand on it, because not one of them ever learned to read." She did not telephone her son that night. She slept a few hours on the cot Earl Sopko had hauled up from the bed of his truck, and she woke in the iron cold before light to prove her figures one last time, twice over, signing nothing even in her mind until the second sum matched the first. Then she walked the length of North Ohio Street with the frost breaking under her boots, past the Union Pacific Spur and the dark co-op feedlot, down to the little scale house Tamsin Okafor had swept clean and lit again, and she asked Tamsin if she might borrow the telephone. She did not tell Brett what she had found in the night. She told him she was tired. She told him an old woman alone had no business holding 90 feet of rusted tin over a town, that the cold had gotten into her hands and her knees for good, and that perhaps he had been right all along, that Sunday's supper had been a kindness, and that it was time to free up what he liked to call the dead family money. She heard him go warm and easy down the line, the voice he saved for the men he meant to buy out cheap, sorry and unhurried, and already counting his own profit. "Bring your sister," she said. Bring Marlene and the little telephone she films everything on, and climb the tower with me Sunday morning, and I will put the place into your hand right where it stands." He came Sunday in town boots that had never once set down on a grain stair. Marlene came a half step behind him with the phone already up and its small red eye already lit, narrating soft and sweet to whoever she pictured watching. Something about the sad old ghost on Ohio and the loving family come at last to lay their mother's burden to rest. Opal met them at the mouth of the boot pit with a steel thermos under her arm and said not one word about the camera. She told them only to keep a hand on the rail every foot of the way, and she went up ahead of them into the dark of the tower. 90 feet is a long climb in silence. By the catwalk, Brett was blowing hard and Marlene had gone quiet and put the phone away to hold the rail with both hands. Opal waited for them out on the narrow steel walk between the black throats of the bins, where the morning came in gray through the broken panes, and all the flat country of Salina County lay spread and pale clear out to the rim of the sky. She unscrewed the thermos and poured tea steaming into the cup and into 2 tin mugs she had carried up, and she put one into each of her children's cold hands, because a thing done right is done slow, and she had waited the better part of 50 years and could surely wait out a cup of tea. Then she began to hand them things, one at a time. The first was a folded paper soft from the warmth of her apron pocket. Brett opened it, expecting, she could plainly see, the deed he had climbed all this way to make her sign over. It was a deed, but it was already signed and already filed, and the name written on the line where the owner goes was not his and never would be. Opal Quigley. Bought clean and outright at the county tax sale for $4, the only bid a single soul had bothered to lay on the ghost his grandfather raised. "You climbed up here to take a thing that has been mine since the courthouse opened that morning," she said. "I only wanted you to drink your tea first." The second thing she set down on the flat of the cold rail between them was small and brass and rubbed smooth, a 1-ounce poise no bigger than the end of her thumb. Marlene gave a thin little laugh. Brett did not. Opal turned it over and showed them the figures cut down into the underside and told them, low and exact, counting it off on her fingers the way the co-op men had laughed at her for doing across 40 years, that the number struck there was no factory's number at all but her father's own, filed away and cut again by his hand, and that it was the single key in all the world that made his books read true. They did not understand her. She had not looked for them to. That was the whole of the thing. That had always, from the beginning, been the whole of the thing. The third thing was the chalk ledger itself, lifted out of the welded tin from the boot pit, with Lucille Brandt's lost page laid back into its rightful place at the front. Opal opened it across her knee in the gray light and read the weights out to them, bin by bin, the false figures first, and then the true ones, the little brass poise turned them into. And as she read, the numbers quit being bushels and became what they had been all along beneath the cipher, a tally of leases and easements and plain cash money, every last column of it running downhill like water to the one bin at the far end of the walk. She stood then and brought them down the catwalk to the 9th bin, the far one hard against the rail spur, the dead one, the one sealed shut her whole life. Earl had been up in the dark with his torch and cut the old welds away, the welds her father had laid as a young man, and the inspection door that had not given an inch in 50 years now hung ready on its hinge. Opal laid her hand flat to the cold curve of it, over the faint cream letters that rose up out of the rust when the light fell sideways across them, the first true name of the place running around the steel, and she pushed, and the door of the empty bin swung wide. It was not empty. Banked dry and whole in the dark, wrapped the careful way her father wrapped seed he meant to carry over a hard year, lay the papers a bank will tear a building to the ground to find and still never think to read. The signed mineral lease beneath the elevator ground. the rail easement lease along the Union Pacific spur, worth more, the two of them together, than every acre Brett had borrowed against out at Prairie Crossing. And across the head of each one, in the county recorder's own hand under the county's own seal, dated the last good winter Hollis Quigley walked the earth, stood the line that drew the final drop of color out of her son's face, recorded Salina County, in the name of my daughter. Brett stood a long while with the gray country at his back, and she watched the ruin come up in him slow, and then, all at once, the very way the answer had risen in her the night before. 90 days he had, and now he had no land beneath the tower to sell. And without the land, the great balloon his Prairie Crossing was strung from would come due against nothing at all. And the same kind of bank that had once taught the Quigleys what it was to be stripped to the boards would this time come and strip him. He opened his mouth. For the first time in the whole of his life, he found nothing in it worth selling. Opal screwed the cup back down onto the thermos. I deeded it at first light, she told him, before ever you backed out of your drive. Not to you, not to myself. The ground and the tower both pass into a trust held for the town and for every farmer who hauls to it, so no man can buy it out from under them, and the next widow who brings a poor load to that scale is paid what an honest grade is worth, and not 1 penny under. The leases were always mine. They will keep me in my own chair, at my own full table, the one Earl and Lucille and Tamsin sit down to now, the rest of my life. She looked at her son, and then square into the small red eye of her daughter's phone, raised again and far too late. You may come and visit me here, she said. You may not inherit. By the end of that month, the clerk at the Salina County Register of Deeds had stamped the grain trust into the books alongside the old leases, and a new tin plate went up beside the scale house door on North Ohio Street, saying that any load hauled to the Ghost on Ohio would be weighed and graded honest, for nothing, by a hand that had been taught how. Out at the edge of town, the half-built rows of Prairie Crossing stood open to the weather with the bank's paper wired fast to the gate, and the ground Brett had staked his whole name on was a thing his hands would never again touch. On the warm mornings now, Opal Quigley goes up the catwalk at first light with a brush and a can of good cream paint, and over the buried letters, her father cut the first die for she lays the name down again, a stroke at a time. Quigley, and then the word, the bank's man, had rolled away to gray. Daughters. And of an afternoon there is a girl come up from town, 9 years old and her chin scarcely clearing the rail, who stands at the rebuilt scale while Opal sets her own hand light over the small one on the beam, and moves it and waits, and moves it once again until the poise rides level and the long needle wavers and stands still. Now she sets the weights,